This video was brought to you by CuriosityStream. For most of the developed world, coronavirus lockdowns are a thing of the past. Successful vaccine programs and mass immunity mean that both populations and public health services are now protected from the worst effects of the virus, and in many places, COVID is now considered the equivalent of a bad flu. This isn't the case in China, where the CCP's strict zero COVID policy, which essentially aims to eliminate the virus entirely via hyper-stringent lockdowns, means that millions of Chinese people have been under lockdown on and off since the virus first arrived in late 2019. While it was originally quite a popular policy, after nearly 3 years of strict and unpredictable lockdowns, the Chinese public's patience for zero COVID has worn thin. And over the weekend, anti-lockdown protests erupted across China, with thousands of Chinese demanding an end to zero COVID, and, in some cases, an end to Xi Jinping. So, in this video, we're going to be looking at the recent protests, what triggered them, and how the CCP might respond to the arguably most direct challenge to their authority since the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests. So let's get straight into the protests. The first protest last week occurred on Friday in Urumqi, the regional capital of Xinjiang, after a fire in an apartment block the day before killed 10 people. Locals blame the disaster on the zero COVID restrictions, first introduced in early August, which made it harder for residents to leave their apartments and delayed local firefighters. There was even some speculation that the victims were welded into their apartments, a practice not uncommon in China during lockdowns. Local authorities originally denied this and actually seemed to blame the victims for their, quote, lack of survival know-how, but backtracked on Friday afternoon, issuing a rare apology and vowing to punish anyone who had deserted their duty. This was too little too late, and on Friday evening, hundreds of residents from Urumqi gathered outside government buildings to demand an end to lockdown. On Saturday, the protests spread to Shanghai, where residents gathered on Urumqi Road to lay floral tributes for the victims of the fire. Many Shanghai locals are deeply opposed to zero COVID, both because Shanghai is one of the more liberal cities in China and because the city suffered through a severe lockdown earlier this year, when almost all the city's roughly 25 million residents were essentially put under house arrest for roughly 2 months. While most of the protests were focused on ending zero COVID, on Saturday evening, at least some protesters were demanding Xi Jinping step down. By Sunday, the protests had spread to at least 10 cities, including Shanghai, Wuhan, and even Beijing. There were also protests at many of China's most prestigious universities, including Xi Jinping's alma mater, Tsinghua University in Beijing. To avoid being charged by the authorities and comment on the CCP's aggressive censorship program, protesters held up blank sheets of paper, a gesture also used by pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. While protesters were mostly peaceful, there were some clashes, and a BBC reporter was apparently beaten while being detained in Shanghai on Saturday evening. According to a statement released by the BBC on Monday, the Chinese authorities implausibly claimed they had detained the journalist for his own good, in case he caught COVID from the crowd. To understand why these protests spread so quickly, you need to understand that, while the immediate trigger might have been the fire in Urumqi, the Chinese public is increasingly fed up with zero COVID. It's now been 3 years on and off lockdowns, and while the CCP have occasionally flirted with relaxing the policy, little progress has been made. Case numbers have since risen to an all-time high, prompting even more lockdowns, and according to analysis from the brokerage firm Noruma, more than 400 million people in China are currently under some kind of lockdown measures, and millions more are at risk of joining them if cases continue to rise. The prospect of further lockdowns and the CCP's inability to get a handle on the recent spike in cases probably motivated the recent protests. Public irritation has also been exacerbated by the sight of crowded stadiums in Qatar, despite the best efforts of China's state broadcaster, which often cut away from footage of the fans. Anyway, by Monday, it looked like the protests had subsided, largely thanks to a significant increased police presence in basically every major Chinese city. Nonetheless, even if they had only lasted a few days, these protests represented the most significant challenge to the CCP's authority since the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. There have been anti-lockdown protests before, but they've always been concentrated in a single city or province, and usually directed at a specific rule or restriction. This is the first time we've seen coordinated nationwide protests really since 1989, and on top of that, they're directed at one of the CCP's flagship policies. So how will the CCP respond? Well, so far the response has been remarkably measured. Sure, there's an increased police presence and a couple of arrests, but we haven't seen a crackdown akin to what happened in Hong Kong last year. Nonetheless, while they might have temporarily stemmed the protests, the CCP are now in a tough position. They essentially have two options. Either they continue with zero COVID, risking further public unrest, or they relax it, which would be politically embarrassing and risk overwhelming China's rickety public health system. The CCP have staked a lot of political capital on zero COVID, and Chinese authorities have enjoyed comparing their policy and relatively low death rate with more reckless Western attitudes, which they dismissively describe as a form of social Darwinism. If the CCP U-turn on zero COVID, it'll obviously be a massive political humiliation. On top of that, scrapping zero COVID could create a surge in COVID deaths and overwhelm China's fragile health system. Less than 40% of over 80s have been fully vaccinated, and China's Sinovac and Sinopharm vaccines are less effective against Omicron than their mRNA equivalent used by most Western countries. A relaxation could trigger a surge in hospitalizations and deaths among the elderly, akin to what happened in Hong Kong earlier this year, which the Chinese health system would be ill-equipped to deal with. China has one of the lowest critical care bed rates in Asia, and there is little public health infrastructure in rural areas. Clearly, the CCP doesn't have any easy options here, and it'll be interesting to see how they respond. If you want to find out though, then be sure to subscribe to the Daily Briefing, where we've already covered this story twice before. Our show where we quickly break down the 4 stories you need to know about every day. Now you can watch on the Daily Briefing YouTube channel or listen by searching for the podcast. But if you want the extended version of the show, that's an extra 5 to 10 minutes every day and an ad-free experience, then you'll need to sign up to our streaming service Nebula. There you'll find exclusive TLDR videos which never make it to YouTube and all of our latest videos ad-free. Now, if you're interested, I have good news because we've partnered with CuriosityStream, the home of the best documentaries online. Thanks to them, you can get both streaming services, CuriosityStream for the docs and Nebula for the bonus TLDR, for less than $15 a year. That's a wild deal and a 26% discount on their already low price. So get yourself a ton of documentaries and exclusive content from your favourite creators, including the Daily Briefing Extended Edition, by signing up using the link below.